Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on the system BIOS. So to get things started, well, let's talk about the fundamentals of what the BIOS is. When it comes to memory, we've talked about memory or storage in a couple of other lessons, right? We talked about these things right here, these RAM sticks, as being volatile or short-term memory, right? So we have our random access memory, our RAM, is volatile. But we've also talked about more long-term storage in the case of our storage devices like hard drives and stuff like that. Well, the BIOS is stored in a third type of memory, and it's a chip that looks something like this. They're not always the same, but good example of what the BIOS chip might look like. And this chip is non-volatile, or what's known as a ROM chip. And ROM stands for read-only memory. Now, we've seen that term ROM somewhere before, right? When we were talking about optical drives like CD-ROMs, DVD-ROMs. Okay, well, it's the same idea. Looks a little different, but it's the same idea in the sense that it's read-only memory. It's been programmed onto this chip once, and then that's it. It does not change. Now, a couple other terms that are used is sometimes it's referred to as non-volatile RAM. I don't like using that term. The reason is because there is a way to modify them, but it's not simple. It's a very complex process, but it's a way of making the changes, but those changes stay in a non-volatile format. And this confuses a lot of people because it's like, well, wait a minute, RAM is volatile, you lose power to the computer, you lose that. What's going on here? All right, if it's RAM, how are we not losing it? So many times we'll think of it as a ROM, just make it permanent. If it's not permanent, if it can be changed, I will tell you it's a special type of storage chip that does have the ability to keep its instructions permanently. It's not capacitors the same way normal RAM is. The third thing that it's sometimes referred to is firmware, which is software on a chip. Okay? It's software that is firmly installed in the chip, firmly installed in the computer. But let's talk about what the BIOS does. And in order to talk about what BIOS does, we have to talk what BIOS stands for. BIOS stands for Basic Input Output System. Okay, that's what BIOS stands for. It's the Basic Input Output System. What that means is it's just that. When you hit the power button on your computer and power starts surging through the motherboard, how does it know what to do? It goes to this chip, and this chip has the instructions on what to do. And one of the first things it does is it performs something called the power on self-test, or what's simply known as POST, P-O-S-T, POST, power on self-test. All right, and this is where it goes through, and it runs a self-test of all the various hardware components in the computer, make sure they're all functioning properly. It also allows the processor to begin communicating with the hardware. It also locates the operating system, right? In other words, the basic input-output system tells the computer what to do when it first turns on, and from there, when it goes through its power on self-test, assuming everything tests out okay, it then looks for the presence of something called a master boot record, which we will find on the boot sector of a hard drive. Okay? When you install the operating system, there is something called the master boot record that is created, and the BIOS looks for this master boot record, and it's that record on the hard drive that then tells the computer what to do next. That's what tells the operating system to load. Okay, so if you have Windows installed on your computer, that's what makes Windows actually begin running. And the BIOS also contains essential system settings, like the clock, okay, is one example. There are more, and we'll look at some of those. But this is all the things that this basic input-output system does. Now, you might remember from the motherboards lesson that we took a look at this little round thing here that I'm going to circle, the complementary metal oxide semiconductor, or CMOS, is where we store the settings, the BIOS settings. In other words, these settings that can be altered, because some people think of that, they go, wait a minute, if BIOS is ROM, right, it's non-volatile memory and it can't be changed, other than if you were to actually do what's called flash that memory. That's the process of updating it, if you flash the firmware. Outside of that, what about these settings when you go into the BIOS, which we'll look at in just a minute here, and you make changes, how does it keep those? Well, that's what this battery is for. This CMOS battery is what keeps just enough power going to the CMOS, the complementary metal oxide semiconductor chip. Okay, this is an actual specialized chip that stores all of those settings. All right, that's how they are maintained. Now, speaking of the BIOS settings, here I have a really terrible screenshot of what one BIOS might look like. In order to get into this screen when you boot the computer, there are a variety of ways that this can be done. You can use the delete key sometimes, the escape key sometimes, various function keys are supposed to be used, maybe even a control key, although this is very rare that you would see like a control alt something. But most importantly, you want to know how to get into the BIOS? You should see it as an option when you are booting the computer. Okay, so when you boot up the computer, you'll see it'll say something like press delete to go into setup, press F2 to go into setup, things like that. And then you have a limited window, as it's going through the power on self-test, to go ahead and hit whatever button that may be. So what I'd like to do now, and I will tell you, this gets a little bit tricky. Fortunately, with the creation of virtualization, I can actually show this to you through a virtual machine, but I will tell you that certain things go very quickly, so you may or may not get an opportunity to see the screen where it actually says what key you hit to go into the BIOS. I believe on my virtual machine it's the delete key, but I want you to see what the BIOS actually looks like. So let's pop over and take a look at that. Okay, so as I mentioned, we need to use a virtual machine to be able to get into the BIOS. So this is going to be a little bit awkward looking, and we'll try to clean it up and maybe zoom in a little bit for you here, because I can't even get a matching resolution on the screen because it's not an actual system here yet. Okay, so what I have is I have VMware Workstation running, and I have a fake machine. It says Windows 7, but it's not. I just created a machine. I called it BIOS Demo. And I'm going to go through a couple things here. I'm actually going to start the machine a few different times because I want you to see where it talks about the button that you would press to get into the BIOS. Okay, it happens to be F2, but I want you to actually be able to see that. And it's going to take a few reboots for me to demonstrate that for you. So let me first of all play the virtual machine, which is turning on the virtual machine, and allow you the opportunity to see this as much as we can. So I'm starting it, and down here right at the bottom, right around here, it's going to say press F2 to enter setup. Now if you miss that, what we're going to do is press Control Alt Delete, reboot again. Look, there it is. It says I'm going to keep rebooting. Press F2 to enter setup. Next to it says press F12 for network boot. And next to that, it says press escape for boot menu. So you know what? Let me hit escape real quick. Let me reboot, hit escape. Boom, look at that. We get a boot menu. Now this actually happens to be part of the BIOS. But now what we're doing is we're getting into one specific part of the BIOS where we're just talking about what device do we want to boot off of. And I can use my arrows to scroll through and say, all right, what do I want to boot off of? Do I want to boot off a removable device, hard drive, CD-ROM drive, or network boot? Okay, now I don't want to actually do any of those. I just wanted to show you that that is part of the BIOS setup. Hitting escape in this particular case allows me, if I know that's all I want to do, I just want to pick a particular boot device, I can do that here. But let's go ahead and reboot again. So I'll press Control Alt Delete, reboot, and this time I'll hit the F2 key. So I'll press Control Alt Delete, hit F2. There we go. I'm kind of speaking what I'm doing because there's no arrow to point and click. This is all done with the keyboard. All right, so you'll see here in this particular setup utility, there are 5 different tabs. Okay, if you look at the top, you'll see we're looking at the main tab right now. And if I hit the right arrow, I'll go to the advanced tab, security tab, boot tab, and exit tab. And if I hit the right arrow again, it just scrolls around, goes back to main. If I hit the up and down arrows, it allows me to move up and down through the different selections on that particular tab. If you look to the right, it gives you instructions. It gives you some help on what you would do. So here I'm looking at the system time. If I wanted to, alter this time, it says that I would use tab to scroll to the right or shift tab to scroll to the left, and then I could hit enter to select the field and adjust the time if I wanted to. Okay, same thing holds true for the date. Actually, let me correct myself. In this particular BIOS, you don't hit enter. Some BIOS, you might actually do that. For this particular one, if you look at the bottom of the screen, Enter will get you into a submenu, but in this case, we're not looking at a submenu, right? There's no arrow next to system time or date, so it's not taking me into a submenu to update it. What you would do if I wanted to change the time right here is I would use plus or minus. Okay, so again, if you look near the bottom, you'll see plus or minus is for changing values. So I'd hit plus to increase or minus to decrease. One thing I want you to keep in mind is each BIOS going to be about the same, but again, have some slight differences. Okay, here it's showing me my legacy diskette. That means my floppy drive. Here's my primary master slave, and my secondary master slave has to do with my IDE drives. Some keyboard features. Shows me my system memory and extended memory. This goes back to the days of DOS where the system memory is always 640K, whereas the extended memory shows that I actually have a gig of memory on this virtual machine. And then there's also some diagnostic stuff that we have the ability to enable if we wanted to. It just says, do you want to display the diagnostic screen during boot? And if I hit enter, you'll see I can choose between disabled or enabled. And if I hit escape, it backs me out of that. Same thing holds true if I happen to be in a submenu. See how there's a little arrow to the left of primary master? That means if I hit enter, it'll take me into a submenu and I can do more stuff. Or I could hit escape, get back out again. Now, we're not going to mess with too much of the stuff here. I just kind of wanted to show you how you navigate the BIOS utility. I mean, on the Advanced tab here, you'll see there's a multiprocessor specification. You might be wondering, well, what the heck does that mean? You look on the right, it says this will configure the MP specification, multiprocessor specification, revision level. Some operating systems require 1.1 for compatibility reasons. So if you find out you have an operating system that says you need to put a multiprocessor specification of 1.1, well, then you set it here. And again, that tends to be a virtualization thing. All right, so there are different things that we can do here. Most of them are not the typical things. And again, it's because we are looking at a virtual machine, not a real machine. I'm going to go down a list of typical things in just a moment. Security screen. This is where I can set up a user password and a supervisor password as far as do I want to have the ability to force users to have to enter a password to get into this setup utility. That would be the supervisor password. Or actually enter a password even just to boot the system, boot into the operating system at all. That would be the user password. And you can set whether you want that to happen under password on boot. And you'll see it's currently disabled. Here's the boot menu. It's the exact same menu that we saw before, except for now we're actually setting the boot order. Okay, so this is the default boot order. You'll notice that one other thing we can do here is we can use the plus or minus key. So let's say we wanted to boot off, or at least try to boot off the CD-ROM drive before the hard drive. I would highlight CD-ROM drive and then hit plus, and that moves it up. Okay, so now the order would be our removable devices first, and if I hit enter, because there's a plus next to it, you'll see that that would be the legacy floppy drive. Then we'll try the CD-ROM drive. Then we go to our hard drives. I can hit plus to see my different hard drives. And then we go to our network boot if we need to. Okay, so that's how we can set the boot order. And then the exit menu is just what do we want to do? Exit out of the BIOS utility, saving changes that we've made. Exit and discard or ignore the changes. That's like hitting cancel, right? If you think of Windows, it's like save or cancel. Load setup defaults is if things ever get like all messed up, you can go back to the original default settings of the BIOS. We can discard any changes that have been made in this particular session, but not leave the BIOS utility. And we can also save things that we've done, but not leave the BIOS utility. All right, so this is pretty much what it looks like, and this is how you would navigate your typical BIOS utility. Now what I want to do is I'm going to actually jump over to the CompTIA objectives. Okay, so if you are taking the certification exam, I just want to kind of go through some of these configuration settings, and then also there's some monitoring settings that you'll find in some of your BIOS utilities. And I want to talk to you about which ones are done more often than other and when you might do them. Now, under BIOS configurations, we talked about boot sequence, and we did look at that here. You have the ability to enable and disable devices. Now, we could look at that here. Under main, you'll notice for like legacy, actually here under primary master, if I hit enter, this is where we can go ahead and choose whether things are enabled or disabled. Or more specifically under advanced, here's your input-output device configuration. Here's where you can actually enable or disable the floppy disk controller, for instance. Okay, so there are many different devices that you may be able to enable or disable. Typical would be if you have like an onboard network card, onboard video, things like that. you may want to enable or specifically disable the onboard chip. Maybe you have an expansion card you'd prefer to use. The date and time, as you can see here, it can be set. It's not typically done in today's world, though, because this is all synchronized within the operating system. Certain processors have multiple clock speeds that you can choose. Okay, I can't show you that here, but some of them do have that. Virtualization support. This is a big one. Most of today's BIOS, and I can't show it to you because I'm actually on a virtual machine, but if I was on the host machine and I was looking at the BIOS, you'll see that I would have to enable virtualization support. Now, it comes enabled by default in most of today's BIOS, right? Because virtualization is a big deal. But if you have an older machine, you may have to go in and enable that. They also mention things like BIOS security, like the passwords that we saw. But we also have things like drive encryption, like BitLocker or TPM, LoJack, things like that. This would be typical on a laptop. You would see that on a laptop BIOS. Now, they also have certain monitoring on some of these BIOS utilities, like your temperature monitoring, and some just monitor. So you can go to the BIOS, you can look, and it'll show you what the current temperature is. Some you can actually tell it to perform an action if that temperature gets too hot. You know, tell it to shut down the system, something like that, before you fry your motherboard or fry your processor. Same thing with fan speeds. If your fan speeds, your RPMs, if they get too slow, which in turn means your temperature is going to go up, you can tell it to do stuff. There are certain intrusion detection notifications. This one, I don't see as much anymore because we have more sophisticated stuff, but it does still exist. So it'll watch for certain things that are signs of somebody trying to break into your computer. Voltage settings, yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I don't know that you mess with that too much anymore. And then clock and bus speed, again, those are more, not as much monitoring. Yeah, you can see them. You don't do a lot with it. But you can set the clock speeds if you have a processor that gives you multiple choices. Okay, so those are the things that are listed on the objectives that you would find. And I just wanted to kind of go over that with you to explain what things you may or may not see. All right, so I wish I could show you more, but again, can't really do it unless I were to go get an actual like video camera and videotape my monitor, because the BIOS is before we get into the operating system, which is where I'm allowed to actually be able to record this stuff for you. So I can't really show you much more detail, but I welcome you and I encourage you. Even if you don't make any changes, you know, go ahead and on your exit screen here, make sure you exit discarding changes so you don't screw up your system. But basically, go into your computer that you're on right now. Get into the BIOS utility and see what options are available to you. So other than that, that's pretty much the demo. Let's go talk about updating the BIOS. All right, now when it comes to updating the BIOS, and we're not talking about the BIOS settings, we're talking about updating the BIOS itself. And this is not something that you're going to do very often, quite frankly, if at all. I mean, these days, updating the BIOS is something we used to do on a fairly regular basis because more and more new features were coming into play. Whereas now, the BIOS just kind of is what it is. You don't see it updated quite as much as it used to. But basically, there are two ways of doing it. One way is through manual BIOS replacement, where you actually have a chip on the motherboard, and that arrow's not pointing to where this chip actually lies, if you look on there. But basically, the idea is you have a chip on the motherboard. The chip can actually be popped out. There's a tool called a chip extractor, and you can actually pull that chip out, and you put a new chip in. All right, that's if it's an actual ROM chip. The other way would be to do what's called a flash BIOS upgrade. Okay, and that's where, and this is kind of, again, real outdated here, where you would actually have BIOS software update utility. I'm illustrating it here like it's on a CD. These days, if you are going to do it, you would download. And this is where you have that specialized non-volatile RAM or firmware that has the ability to be updated. I will tell you the process of flashing the BIOS is a very dangerous process. And not physically dangerous, like electrical dangerous, but dangerous as in if you were to lose power, you know, let's say you had a power outage and you lose power to the computer, right in the middle of doing a BIOS flash update, you could be completely out of luck at that point. Okay, in other words, the system doesn't have like this built-in mechanism of let's keep all the old instructions until the new ones are completely ready. It's just kind of updating things, and if you lose power right in the middle of that, you now have a defective BIOS chip, and you really have no choice but to get a new motherboard or a new BIOS chip, because again, you're going to hit the power button to turn on the computer and nothing's going to happen because it has no good instructions. So you want to definitely be careful of doing that. And with that, that does bring us to the end of this lesson, where we learned all about, well, the BIOS. It's kind of a quick and easy thing to understand, but an important component to the system, because it's what allows your computer to start. Without the BIOS, you never get from pushing that power button to getting an operating system up on the screen. So I thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson.